Welcome to Mikun's Hardware. In this video I'm going to tell you what is external CH341a USB flash programmer and how to use it to flash or read motherboard BIOS. You can use this programmer to restore your motherboard BIOS if you have flashed incompatible BIOS onto your motherboard and the motherboard has got bricked. You can also use this programmer to perform procedure of turbo boost unlock on the motherboards which have locked BIOS and you do not have ability to write modified BIOS using FPT or AFU-DOS AFU-Win applications. First of all, you have to understand that I'm not responsible for anything you do with your hardware, and you are the only one responsible for every action you take and for every consequence you might receive. If you understand the risk and wish to proceed, let's take a look at what is CH341a external USB flash programmer. On this picture I have highlighted all the major parts of the programmer using red and green color. There are two LEDs on the programmer. One is red, it's a power indication. It has two lighting mode, one is bright, another one is dim. If the LED indicator lights up in the bright mode, this indicates that the USB programmer has enough power and everything is okay. If the LED indicator lights up in the dimmer mode, this means that you have connected your BIOS chip on the wrong side and there is a short circuit. You have to disconnect your BIOS chip and connect it with the other side. The green LED indicator blinks when the programmer is reading or writing some data onto the chip. There is also a bunch of switches on the programmer to adjust the working mode of the programmer. If you plan to use your CH341a with the computer, then don't touch anything there, just leave it as shown on the picture. Additionally, you will find a small scheme which demonstrates how to install BIOS chips on the programmer. From the scheme we can see that CH341a USB programmer can work with chips of 25 and 24 series. There are two different sections, one for 25th, another one for 24th series. With the two additional pictures you see examples of a clip connected onto the flash programmer, as well as a BIOS chip installed onto the USB flash programmer. This is basically all you need to know about CH341a layout, and now it's time to start to prepare to read or write the BIOS. First of all, you need to identify what is your BIOS chip. This can be done with the FPT tool if you have not yet bricked your motherboard. Even if your BIOS chip is locked and you are not able to read or write to the BIOS using FPT tool, you can still attempt to make a backup of your BIOS. It will identify your BIOS chip and provide you required information about that chip. If this is not possible for some reason, you need to find the chip on the motherboard. These chips have 8 pins, 4 pins on each side. Once you find a chip which seems like a BIOS chip, look at the title on the chip and search in Google by this title. To flash a file onto the BIOS chip, you need a file of the same size as the chip. The chips might be 8 MB, 16 MB or 32 MB in size. Most of the Chinese X79 motherboards use 8 MB chips. Most of the Chinese X99 motherboards use 16 MB chips. There is also a few X99 boards which use 8 MB chips. Many branded motherboards, especially the latest revisions of AM4, B450 and X470 motherboards, use 32 MB chips. So make sure that your binary file which you are planning to write onto the BIOS chip has exactly the same size as your BIOS chip. For all the branded motherboards, you can download BIOS from the manufacturer website. Sometimes this BIOS is provided not in the binary format but in a so-called capsules. For example, Asus is providing their BIOS in capsules and not in the raw format. These capsule files have extra information which is not written onto the BIOS chip. That's why the files are slightly bigger than the BIOS chip. In this case, you have to extract the binary file from the capsule, and this can be done using UEFI tool. There you have to open your cap file, go to the Actions menu and extract your BIOS. UEFI tool can be downloaded by the link provided in the video description. To work with the CH341a USB programmer, I recommend a completely free and open source tool called S-Programmer. It can be downloaded from GitHub and the link will be provided in the video description. Once you have downloaded all required tools and prepared your binary BIOS file to write onto your chip, it's time to connect USB programmer to the BIOS chip. If your motherboard is using soldered BIOS chip, you might need to perform some additional steps. Disconnect everything from your motherboard. Sometimes it's okay to leave CPU onto the motherboard, sometimes you need to remove it. Leave the battery on the motherboard and connect 24 and 8-pin power from the power supply. Power up the power supply, but do not turn on the motherboard. Different motherboards have different physical layout, and on some motherboards it is required to have external power from the power supply in order to be able to power up the BIOS chip on the motherboard so CH341a could read or write the data from the chip. First, you can try to identify your BIOS chip without external power supply connected. If that does not work, you need to perform these steps. If your motherboard has removable BIOS chip, you do not have to perform these steps. You need to carefully remove the BIOS chip from the motherboard and inject it straight onto the USB flash programmer. In case of a solder chip, you have to use the external clip which is connecting USB flash programmer with the BIOS chip on the motherboard. Once the BIOS chip is connected with the programmer, you have to plug in the programmer into a USB port. I recommend to use USB ports on the back side of your computer, and it's recommended to pick USB ports which support fast charging. If you do not have such ports, pick USB 3.0 ports, those are the blue ones, over the USB 2.0 ports, which are the black ones. Usually USB 3.0 ports are supporting high electrical current compared to USB 2.0 ports. This might be required to be able to properly read or write the BIOS chip. Once everything is connected, start sprogrammer.exe application. In the application, open Hardware menu and select your flash programmer, which is CH341a. After that, press the question mark button to identify the connected BIOS chip. There shall be a small pop-up window with different suggestions. From the suggestion, you have to pick your BIOS chip and double-click it. If the pop-up window is not showing up after clicking the question mark button, this means that your BIOS chip is not recognized. This could be because it's not connected correctly and you can try to connect it with the other side. This could also be that USB flash programmer is not recognizing this chip because it's not compatible, but it also could be that USB flash programmer does not have enough power. You can try to use different USB ports, and you can also try to connect the power supply onto the motherboard as described in the previous step. If the BIOS chip is successfully identified, it's time to go and make a backup of your current BIOS. This step is not required if you have a bricked motherboard which does not have a working BIOS. To create a backup, click the green arrow button to read current BIOS state. Wait for the completion and after that save the file by clicking the diskette button. You can provide any file name, but I recommend to include motherboard name, date and backup word into the file name, so a few days later or a few months later you won't be guessing what this BIOS was, when it was created and why it was created. Additionally, you can check the read result. If the result contains only FF values, most likely the read was not successful. FF means that the BIOS chip is completely empty. This could be the case if your motherboard is not working and the BIOS chip is physically completely empty. But if your motherboard is working and you are trying to read BIOS, but the result contains only FF values, this means that the reading procedure was not successful and USB flash programmer is not able to properly read data from your BIOS chip. Once you have saved a backup of your BIOS, or you do not need to back up your BIOS, you can start to write your modified or restored BIOS onto the motherboard. First, you need to select your binary file which you want to write onto the motherboard. For this, click the folder button, pick up your file, write it onto the BIOS chip using the unprotect, erase, program, verify command. Wait for the completion and you are all done. This is all you have to do to write your binary file onto the BIOS chip on the motherboard. Once you are done reading and writing BIOS with the external USB flash programmer, you have to power off the power supply if you have connected it to the motherboard. Carefully disconnect CH341a from your BIOS chip. Install the BIOS chip back onto the motherboard if you were using a removable BIOS chip. After that, you have to clear CMOS values by removing the motherboard battery and shortening the clear CMOS jumper on the motherboard. Wait for 30 seconds in such state. After that, disconnect the clear CMOS jumper, install every required component onto the motherboard, including the battery, start up the computer, and enjoy your restored or updated BIOS. Most likely, careful viewers have noticed that sprogrammer tool has quite some extra features But in order to be able to read and write BIOS onto your motherboard, what I have told you is more than enough. Hopefully this little guide will help someone restore their bricked motherboard, or maybe it will help someone to perform procedure of turbo boost unlock on the motherboards which have locked BIOS. Other than that, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope you have enjoyed it, goodbye.